So I'll begin my interview with Daniel Seaman joining me from Israel. And he has been a government official for almost 30 years now. And now he is an analyst. He works as an analyst on different TV channels, local and international. Okay, so I'm glad to know that there are a few Arabs and Jews living there, coexisting there harmoniously. However, there are
reports, the majority of the population.
In Jerusalem or in the entire territory?
In the entire country,
Okay.
I wish that you would come here to visit someday. You can see
well,
for
I
yourself.
hope so. Yeah. So
it's not something. It's not impossible. I met online a young Afghani Muslim from Jalalabad who had no knowledge of Jews at all, and we connected there. He was very smart. He used social media to discover Israeli hospitals and worked with Afghani Jews from the United States who helped him bring young Pakistani, by the way, Afghani and Persian children to be treated in Israeli hospitals. He found some project that is going on here and he brought them here to be treated in Israeli hospitals. And then he came to visit here as well exactly 3 years ago. I don't want to say anything. It's very dangerous for him because he came here. He was astounded by what he discovered here in Israel. And he said it was nothing that what he had seen all the years in the media. And I mentioned something that I'm very proud of. He said that he was so welcomed any place that he went, and you will experience this yourself. He was so welcomed with Jewish Israelis when they found out that he was from a Muslim from Afghanistan, were so welcoming and so happy to show him around that he never, you mentioned what you've seen in the media. The media tells you perhaps 1,000 words. It doesn't tell the whole story. The whole story
Daniel,
here
you mentioned
is
that
magnificent.
Pakistani came to Israel. I mean, I'm glad that they had warm stories to share about the Israeli community over there, but it's impossible for a Pakistani to have traveled to Israel because our passport doesn't allow us to travel to Israel. There is on the first page, it's written that this passport is valid for all the countries except for Israel. So I think there might be a mistake there.
Government.
It couldn't have been a Pakistani. I'm not sure about Afghanistan, but it couldn't have been a Pakistani.
I can tell you this, that the passport is issued by your government. Yeah. Your government is the one that determines where its population can go. When I was director of the government press office in Israel, it's the unit that works with foreign press, about 20 years ago, I was very fortunate to escort it's less than 20 years during the second war in Lebanon. There was a former general in the Pakistani army who had become a journalist. He came to Israel as a journalist, and I escorted him around and took him wherever he wanted to go. I was there with him because he was a very interesting gentleman, and I was very pleased to make his acquaintance. And over the years, there were quite a few people carrying Pakistani. It has to go through, on our side, it has to go through a special, it's checked by our security authorities. But if there's no security problem, then we don't stamp their passport, so they don't have to answer to the authorities in Pakistan when they go back. But if you have another passport, or if you want to come visit here through Europe, and this is how my Afghani friend came, he came through India. He went to India, and from there he came here with a Pakistani friend of his. And they came here, and they mentioned at the airport, please don't stamp our passport. And they're given a piece of paper, and they are allowed to come into Israel. So we have no problem with you coming here and seeing things for yourself, and we encourage you to come here. It's not a simple situation, I know. There are many tragedies, but altogether you will leave here feeling very hopeful towards the future.
Well, there's nothing wrong in learning more about anything, in fact. So that's okay. So you mentioned that, no, actually, I assume that you have some good amount of respect for Benjamin Netanyahu.
Yes.
But
yes, I know him. I know him for 30 years, and I worked under him as prime minister.
But he recently
for, 7 years.
dissolved. I think just within correct me if I'm wrong, within a time span of 2 years, he has dissolved the parliament 4 times. And he is, since May, he's facing corruption charges. Please talk about this.
Yes, it's a big debate over that right now. In Israel, there is a political impasse in Israel. We have a parliamentary system, and none of the parties were able to get a majority through which they could create a stable government here. By the way, it's a situation that Italy, for example, is very famous for. I remember years ago being a student of political science, I remember looking at the situation in Italy and saying, oh my God, how can they manage there? And now we've become a modern version of the Italian parliamentary system. A lot of it is due to personal relationships or unfortunate personal relationships between Israeli politicians who are not putting their personal unhappiness aside and egos aside and refuse to sit with him in government. This is despite the will of the Israeli people. Netanyahu does get a majority of the seats, but not enough. And by the way, in our history, there's never been a party that received an absolute majority. They always have to form a coalition government. So here they have not been successful in doing it for the past 2 years.
Are these recent attacks by any chance a way of Benjamin Netanyahu to gain sympathies of the Israeli public to get reelected?
If anything, it is something that the Israeli public would not be pleased about. No, Netanyahu for many years has been accused of trying to create, and always we've been warned. Over the past year, Israel has been, throughout our 73 years of history as a nation, the past 10 years have been the most stable and had the least number of military incidents and conflicts with the Palestinians, with the Arabs, that have ever been documented in our history. He has refrained at every opportunity from using the might of the state of Israel. By the way, some people who support him are not pleased with that. And a lot of this has to do, and I happen to know him personally, is because of the personal tragedy that he suffered in his family, and he says this openly. His brother was the commander of the commando unit that freed the Israeli hostages in Entebbe in 1977. And he fell in that operation. He was his older brother. And Netanyahu says very clearly that he remembers how that tragedy affected his parents, and he never wants any Jew or Arab to, and if he can reduce the tragedies happening, he will do all in his power to limit that, and he's done that. So for people to say this right now is contradictory to the realities.
Exactly. It's pretty ironic for him to say this if he himself has faced the tragedy of losing a loved one, and it was such a traumatic experience. Then why destroy homes of people? Why kill their loved ones? And since now we're talking about destruction of homes, let's talk about Sheikh Jarrah, which is the recent area where Israeli settlements are coming to, I will use the word that I read online, invade the homes of Palestinians. And the kinds of coverage we've seen on social media, it's quite raw. It's not really shown on the mainstream media. We see Palestinian families crying over there, and the court order hasn't come through yet. Again, please correct me if I'm wrong. The court order hasn't come through yet. Even then, the Israeli forces have started evacuating, let's say, they started tearing families out of their houses and their homes. So if Benjamin Netanyahu claims to be so traumatized by that and he doesn't want any Arab or Jew to go through this, why is all of this happening?
Again, it's one of those situations where the media takes a small issue and blows it out of proportion. We're talking about 4 people, and if you don't believe me, I'll send you later on a woman, an Arab woman, I believe, from Syria, who has been talking about this and been critical of not the Jews, but the people making this into such a big issue. This is an ownership problem, a very simple one with, by the way, Sheikh Jarrah was a mixed Jewish Arab city before the creation of the State of Israel. My family lived nearby, and they lived together, Jews and Arabs, in that neighborhood. That area remained under Arab control, under Jordanian control. They expelled the Jewish population from there. There was an exchange of population. Again, I talk about the Indian-Pakistan conflict. You're familiar with the exchanges of population. This also happened here, where Jews moved to Israel and Arabs stayed in the Arab side or moved to the Arab side. This was under Jordanian, and it leads to a question, if the Arabs so care about the Palestinians, why did Jordan, who were in control of this area for 19 years, why they never created a Palestinian state? But just a question to be raised. We don't have to deal with this at the moment. But the fact of the matter is that these homes were owned by Jews. The deeds of ownership were provided by Jordan itself, not by Israel. Jordan provided this, that these were buildings owned. They allowed the families to remain there, but they asked them to pay rent. They refused to pay rent and have not paid rent for nearly 40 years. This was brought before, and we're talking about 4 families. This was brought before the Supreme Court in Israel. The Supreme Court evaluated the whole system and came that everything was done in accordance with the law. If they're not paying, they have to be removed. And this is what the government tried to do.
If a court order hasn't come through yet.
It erupted into a political issue.
If a court order hasn't come through yet, how is it done?
It did come through. No, it did come through. They filed an appeal. And because of the violence, Netanyahu himself requested that the court not debate the issue right now and keep it at a status quo until it can be resolved. But here's an issue, by the way, and one of the problems we have here is there are many who appear to present good intention, progressive anarchist elements from the West. And these are usually spoiled, you talked about rich people before, spoiled rich kids who are giving money and they come here to cause problems. And Sheikh Jarrah was a place where Jews and Arabs lived together very peacefully, if you want to call it that. They lived together. That's what counts. And these people came there deliberately and stirred up problems that could have been resolved very quickly. And instead, they blew it up into a political issue that Hamas took over and took responsibility for in trying to benefit their situation vis-a-vis the PLO. So some things at times are much more simpler than the media present them as being.
Okay, but I don't think, like if, for example, if somebody just knocks on my door and goes like, okay, get out of this house, I don't think it's a small issue.
That's not the way it happened. That's not the way it happened.
Okay. So we are running out of time.
Because this has been going on, like I said, for 40 years. This has been a discussion that's been going on in the courts now for 12 years. So it's not something that's handled slightly.
Okay. We're running out of time. So let's just I just have like a few more questions, maybe 2 or 3 more.
Just a few. There are so many questions that can be raised here.
Okay. We have to keep the time in mind. Right. I
understand.
So I was reading about this, of course, like probably everybody else who are curious about finding out what's going on. I learned about the term intifada. Intifada is when is Palestinian Arab uprising. They wrote it there. Yes. So it happened in 1987 and then in 2000. And when it happened in 1987, there were 2,000 Palestinians killed. And in contrast, 200 Israelis were killed. And in 2000, when the Intifada happened, 5,000 Palestinians were killed. And now some analysts like yourself are forecasting that there might be another Intifada on the way.
We're in the midst of one right now.
You think an Intifada is happening right now?
Of course, they're not even shy about it. That's exactly what they're saying. The unfortunate part of it is that Israeli Arabs have joined in on it this time.
Okay. Why must they be shy about defending themselves?
They shouldn't be shy about defending themselves, but they're not defending themselves. They're assaulting Israelis. And you mentioned the 5,000 people were killed by the in the Palestinian Society 20 years ago in the Intifada that erupted then. This was in the midst of peace negotiations going on when Israel withdrew its forces from 48% of the territories and 99% of the Palestinians were under PLO control. They were no longer under Israeli control. And it's at that time that they chose to commit the suicide bombings in Israeli cities and towns. We had 2,000 victims, men, women, and children at that time. So the numbers are irrelevant because the numbers are not an expression of being justified or not. It's a question of an imbalance of force. When the Israelis tried to go to peace, they took our hand for peace and tried to cut it off. And at that point, I'm sorry to say, and I'm not going to be apologetic about it, we defended ourselves. And it's unfortunate that when they embed themselves among the civilian population, there are going to be civilian casualties. And as I mentioned it before, the unfortunate consequence of this is we cannot be more responsible for Palestinians than their own leadership. And if they have any complaints, it should come to the leadership that put them in danger's way. And I go and I repeat again something I said before. We have magnificent military abilities that we do not use against them because we do not want to annihilate the Palestinians. We could have very easily done it. It's not something that we want to do. But on the other hand, we cannot afford to have our civilians be helpless and be victimized by the Palestinians. It's unfortunate, but that's the issue.
Okay.
Now, when you talk to Palestinians here, even those who live with us together, they'll tell you very quickly. For them, the occupation is not 1967. It's not the areas in Judea and Samaria or the West Bank, as you call it. In their eyes, all of Israel is occupied, and they do not accept the presence of a Jewish state here. That is the essence of the conflict right now. This is a conflict that's been going on for 120 years. They will not accept us. They do not accept us today. And we will not just lie down and die because of that. I'm sorry.
I think a formal occupation by the Israeli forces, by Israeli Jews, actually started back in 1917 with the Balfour Declaration, when British government actually made it okay for Jewish people to settle here. I think that's when it, if we talk about the modern history, that's when it actually started.
For 2,000 years. That's an incorrect interpretation of history.
Okay.
You can take, censuses were conducted here by the Roman Catholic Church several times over throughout history, over the generations.
That's taking it too far. If we get into the history aspect of it, then there's so much more to talk about.
Very relevant to today because you have an incorrect historical interpretation. Throughout history, there was always a Jewish presence. At many times, there was a Jewish majority here. What the so-called Palestinians, and by the way, Arabs never called themselves Palestinians. Palestinians was the term that Jews were kept because this was a term given to them in order to erase their identity by the Roman Empire. That's how far back this goes. And I'm sorry,
the Jews were present there
were the Palestinians, not the Arabs who lived here. They refused to consider themselves Palestinians because those were the Jews. And when they moved here, when Jews moved here at the same time, and the numbers were very much the same. So it wasn't the British did us no favors. This was the return of the Jewish people to their ancient homeland that even the Muslims consider it as the Jewish land itself. In the Quran itself, it is said that the land of Israel is the land of the Jews. We didn't come out of nowhere. We didn't come from outer space. There was no word of Palestine in the Quran at any point.
There is more in Quran. There is much more in Quran than just that statement.
Quds is not mentioned a single time in the Quran itself. It's mentioned over 400 times in the Jewish Bible. So we have our roots here. We're not going to be apologetic about it. We're willing to live with the Arabs here as we've done for 73 years. But we're not going to live here with them turning to violence and expecting us not to respond and defend ourselves.
Okay, so
I'm
Daniel,
sorry, I have to be so determined about it, but that's the reality.
It's okay. I got you here to share your point of view, and that's exactly what you're doing.
And I appreciate it.
I appreciate it.
It's certainly not something that is understandable and taken for granted. What you're doing is something that I'm very grateful to you and tremendously honor you for this.
Thank you. So Daniel, okay, history aside, religion aside, let's just speak of these past 7 days, and even yesterday, I think it was Nakba Day, when the Palestinians were remembering the time. Okay, so they started the war, and 750,000 of them were killed on Nakba Day.
No.
Okay.
What was the number that you used?
750,000.
750,000. 750,000 is the number of which they claim to be those who were expelled from this area by Israel. Which, by the way, there were those who were expelled, but the large majority were asked by the invading Arab armies, were asked to leave, so it would be easier for them to eliminate the Jewish civilians here. So again, it was another tragedy bestowed upon them by their own people.
And everything else was a consequence of that, right?
Yes.
Okay,
by the way,
so let's just...
At the same time, very important, at the same time, over 1 million Jews who had lived for over 1,000 years in Arab countries and were not part of the conflict here were expelled violently. Were expelled from Morocco, Algeria, Libya, Iraq, Afghanistan, and all throughout the Middle East were expelled. Over 1 million, and they were absorbed inside the state of Israel. There is no Jewish refugee problem because Israel absorbed those who were expelled from Arab countries, and they could not bring their money and could not bring their belongings with them. They were massacred and had to leave. So Daniel, there is a balance.
From a point of view of basic human empathy, Let's just, I'll be a human right now. I have no religious, political, country, any affiliation. And let's assume you're also just a human with no affiliation at all. Okay, are we in that zone?
Yes.
Okay, so if this group is treated so violently and mercilessly when it was a weaker group, so this group gets power and this group gets weaker, is it fair for this group to use the same kind of treatment when they have gone through the same on the weaker side? Empathy, just speaking from the point of view of empathy, is it fair?
Life is not fair. Reality is not fair. You're asking for something that many people take a simplistic view of it. And by the way, your comparison is historically and practically incorrect. We are not doing. We are not doing. And by the way, if you want to talk about the Palestinian tragedy, the Palestinian refugees who are not accepted as citizens in Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Iraq, and other places in the Middle East are massacred by their fellow Arabs. You have nearly 100,000 in Syria in refugee camps, Palestinians who were murdered over the past 10 years, not by Israel, but by Arabs themselves. You had a similar number of thousands killed in Jordan. Nobody speaks about that because nobody, I'm sorry to say this, nobody cares about the Palestinian issue except when it is in a way to bash the state of Israel. And the only place where Palestinians have full rights, are treated equally, share the country, the only place this happens is under Israel. So if you want to make that comparison, you use those facts as what is happening. And then you have to understand that if Israel resorts to using of violence or of force in order to protect itself, it is because we have no other choice. Mm-hmm. And that's the reality. And that's the equation that needs to be made here. Not the simplistic view. Yes, of course, it's not fair when one side or the other, but that's not what Israel is doing. That's the way the media is presenting it. That's why people who are manipulating the reality here are doing it. And that's the same people who use the Palestinians, because all these people marching in defense of Palestinians, not a single one of them said a word in favor of the Palestinians who are being butchered in Syria. You know who did, by the way? The state of Israel. We opened up the border with Syria and we allowed thousands of Palestinians to be treated in hospitals here. Not only children in Pakistan and Afghanistan, as I mentioned before, that are served here and treated in our hospitals at our expense, but Palestinians who are being treated roughly and being murdered in refugee camps in Syria, and other Syrians, by the way, it's not only Palestinians. We treated over 10,000 people over the past few years.
Two wrongs don't make a right. If violence is
I'm not saying
happening
about
in an XYZ country,
realities,
it doesn't justify violence happening in an ABC country.
Again, but not every use of violence is something that is used to abuse somebody else. Sometimes you use force in order to defend yourself. That's the unfortunate reality of life.
Let's move on. There are reports coming in that, again, where the Jews and Arabs are living harmoniously, they're actually turning against each other now. So is the territory under danger of a civil war now? You said Intifada is already underway.
No, because there's law and order in Israel, and these are Israeli citizens. Unfortunately, they use the month of Ramadan in mosques to incite the public and get them riled up, and they assaulted and lynched Jewish neighbors of theirs. And I know this from an Arab friend of mine in the city of Lod, who told me that he lives in a building of Jews, Muslims, and Christians together, and both the Christians and the Jews in that building felt very uncomfortable. Now, not all the Muslims partook in this, and not all the Muslims were involved, but the Muslim element were the ones who instigated this. And
you know, there is video evidence. Now that you speak about the mosque incident, the Al-Aqsa mosque incident, there is footage that shows rubber bullets being fired at the unarmed Palestinian Arab protesters.
They're not unarmed. They were using stones and projectiles and Molotov cocktail bombs.
I think there's a large difference between.
If this happens in Pakistan, do the Pakistani police allow this to happen? No, you're asking us to do something that you would not ask any military police force or any civilized country in the world to accept this kind of violence without a response.
But is
you
it
cannot
fair to
absolve them of responsibility. You cannot absolve them of the responsibility. If they raise the hand against the military and the police, in this case, it's no military, it's a police force protecting them inside the Al-Aqsa Mosque, they used force against them because they were incited by the imams. I'm sorry, but it's going to elicit a response. It looks horrible for us. People like yourself, who is a very honorable and respectable person, I'm sure you're shocked about this. And it's horrible for me to have to stand here and defend our side, but I'm not going to excuse it, and I'm not going to hide from the harsh realities here that there are an element that will never accept the Jewish presence here, and they're the ones who are behind all of this, and they're the ones instigating it, and they're causing trouble not only for the Jews, but also for their fellow Muslims.
Is it fair to use rubber bullets or live ammunition against stones and rocks? Just a yes or no answer.
Have you ever been stoned? Have you ever had rocks thrown in your direction? They can kill. They're lethal. They're very lethal. And therefore, the response is either opening up in gunfire. And by the way, gunfire is only used when gunfire is used on the other side. There are thousands and tens of thousands of weapons which Arabs, Palestinians have illegally, and they use it from time to time in terrorist attacks. So only when gunfire, and they open gunfire, is gunfire used by the Israeli police. Rubber bullets are an acceptable use of police forces throughout the world. And yes, when you have no other chance, another choice, you use rubber bullets. Again, if the Palestinians, if the Muslim prayers do not want the Israeli police to enter the area of Al-Aqsa Mosque, don't start attacking the Jewish prayers who are beneath on the Temple Mount. The Temple Mount below it is the Western Wall. And the Western Wall itself, which was the basis for the temple, is where the Jews pray today. And the Muslims throw rocks at them and prevent them from praying. So I don't see that as an acceptable prayer method among Muslims. I don't know why they employ it there. Okay.
So thank you for your point of view. So now let's just focus on the past 7 days, right? International laws are present to protect communities and countries, especially for the oppressed, and human rights which pertain to the meeting of vital human needs like food, clothing, shelter, health, education. They're all listed in the international laws. So the basic rights that I just mentioned, food, clothing, shelter, health, education. Which of these rights have been violated by the Israeli occupation forces in Palestine?
None of them.
None of them. Okay. So violation of human rights also include genocide, slavery, torture, cruel, inhuman treatment, and degrading treatment, and collective punishment, arrest without due process, imprisonment without fair trial, invasion of the home, and taking property without due process of law. Which of these human rights have been violated by the Israeli occupation forces in Palestine?
None of them.
None of them.
You mentioned genocide. It's an interesting point that you raised because a lot of times we're accused of genocide. If you check just the statistics themselves, the population under Israeli control from 1967 until today of the Palestinians in both Judea and Samaria and the Gaza Strip has risen more than 10 times under Israeli control. The only time there was the Palestinian population was diminished in Judea and Samaria was under Jordanian control. And under Jordanian control, there was no system of higher education under Israel. Between 1967 and when Israel left in 1993, there were 17 universities established for higher education in Judea and Samaria and the Gaza Strip. Not by Israel. We allowed the Palestinians to do these things. Food, health, etc. Even in the Gaza Strip today, which continue to fire missiles at Israel, we allow international community to use the ports in Israel to import food, etc., and all the necessities of the Palestinians. And it's constantly, every day, even now, while missiles are being fired at Israel, Israel gives electricity and gas to the Palestinians in Gaza, and the border crossings are open so that goods can cross in there. None of this has been affected, even now in the midst of an armed conflict that has erupted. So all these accusations of Israel have no basis in reality, I'm sorry to tell you.
Okay.
Actually, I'm pleased to tell you that they don't.
Continuing with the human rights, and I'm quoting these from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Convention for the Protection and Prevention and Punishment of the crime of genocide. It's from the UN document, and the Article 33 of Geneva Convention, and Article 9, 10, 11, 12, 17, 25, 26 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, continuing the listed human rights. They also include freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of religion, the right to take part in government, and the right to move freely within, to, and from one's own country. Which of these human rights are being violated by the Israeli occupied forces in Palestine?
None of them. You mentioned that you heard a lot on the media. As you can see, the media is reporting freely. They have Arab media, Arab language media, the international media. There's no prevention of that happening. They've been free. The only reason for the past 12 years there haven't been elections in that area is because the Palestinians themselves and the leader of the Palestinian Authority refuses to go to election. They were supposed to have them this week, I believe. That is not happening, not because of Israel, but because of they themselves. They chose not to do that. From 1993, when the Palestinian Authority took over 43% of the territory and 99% of the population, Israel is no longer responsible for what is happening inside the Palestinian Authority areas. So in Israel itself and any place else that Israel is responsible for, none of these things apply. I can just say that all these things, yes, one of the reasons Israel never annexed these territories is there's another issue in international law, which is recognized, which is military occupation. Israel was attacked by Arab countries in 1967, and it took control of these areas through a war of self-defense and maintained a military control over these areas until such time as a resolution is found. And this is also recognized and acceptable under international law.
Okay, you said that Arab media is free to report within the territory of Israel. Then why were the buildings of AP and Al Jazeera tore down?
It wasn't the building of AP and Al Jazeera, it was the building of the Palestinian Hamas and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad headquarters. Say, and they used those positions. They rented out space to the Arab journalists there who worked for these international organizations. I can tell you again, myself, as director of the government press office, I issued more than 400 press credentials to Arab media organizations who worked in Israel and in the Palestinian Authority areas to Palestinians employed by foreign media. So they are recognized and do receive accreditation by Israel. Gaza is no longer under Israeli control. It is under Hamas control. The media organizations chose to be there. None of them complained about the fact that building a military installation among the civilian population is a war crime, by the way. You mentioned international law. They knowingly situated themselves among them, never complained to Hamas who were violating international law, and we informed them before demolishing the building. They were informed to vacate the premises, that Israel is going to demolish it, and that's what we did yesterday. It's unfortunate that it came to that, but these buildings, you said we've been at war for a week. We waited for a whole week hoping that they wouldn't continue using these facilities to direct attacks against Israeli civilians, when it was quite clear that this was the location that they were using in order to pinpoint their attacks against Israelis. It had to be taken out. It was a necessity, unfortunately, to protect our civilians.
So you are in a state of war for the past week?
Absolutely.
It's a full-fledged war.
I don't know what else you call it.
Okay. So these are all the questions I had that I wanted to get a point of view from an Israeli to see how, I think you're representing the Israeli Jews living there. So I just wanted to get...
I represent there's a lot of debates going on here as well. There are a lot of different views here. But I can say that working for the government for 30 years, always, if there's not one thing, there's another thing going on here. I do more or less convey the beliefs of the majority of the Israeli population today, yes.
So I'm glad you took out the time to share your point of view, your perception with me, and I think the people who are listening or watching this.
You being so honorable and really, I appreciate it, because it's not something I take for granted. Most people just think they know what's going on here, and they form an opinion about it, and you want to learn. Again, you can continue with your sympathies for the Palestinians. It's an honorable position. I can understand it. You have your right to do that. Yes, what they're going through is horrible, and it's tragic at times. But I respect the fact that you're willing to listen to us and understand why at times we have to do things that we're not pleased about. We don't want to do this. We want to live here. I want my children to grow up. I don't want them to be under missiles. I have an 86-year-old mother who is not running for shelter because she can hardly move. So she stays in bed all day. I wish she wouldn't have to do that. But
so how do you see,
the choice
just to
we
wrap
have
it up now,
is,
just to wrap it up, how do you see the end of all of this? There's
I wish
no
I could
end.
tell you 100%. I wish I could tell you. I was very optimistic this year because of the barriers breaking down between Jews and Arab countries, between Israel and Arab countries, and many of them seeing that Israel is not what they've been told for all these years. On the contrary, they have a lot to benefit from. There are those elements who do not want this to happen. And right now, they have the upper hand. I hope that many of us, both Jews and Arabs and Muslims, can go through this period and hope that things calm down and go back to building these bridges between both sides.
Let's hope so. Let's hope that peace prevails and everybody gets to live happily and safely with their futures intact and their presents just fine. Thank you so much, Daniel Seaman, for your time and for sharing and expressing how you feel on behalf of the majority of the Israeli community living over there. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.